That's what my CEO told me after 12 years of building the very systems he still brags about. One sentence, delivered like a verdict, while his cousin, who'd never managed a real deadline, sat there smirking in a chair that should have been mine. I walked out carrying a box instead of a future, convinced that everything I'd poured into that place had died in that room, but they didn't know something. Something small, something forgotten. If you've ever been pushed out, overlooked, or replaced, tell me your story and subscribe so you don't miss what happened next. I used to believe that if you worked hard enough, stayed late enough, carried enough weight on your shoulders, a company would eventually see you as irreplaceable. That belief kept me showing up before sunrise, leaving long after the parking lot emptied, and pouring 12 years of my life into Northbridge Dynamics as if it were my second home. I didn't grow up with much, so building something that mattered felt like a promise I'd made to myself. And for a long time, I thought I was keeping it. I joined Northbridge back when we operated out of a converted storage facility that still smelled like rubber and dust. I was the operations analyst nobody noticed, but everyone depended on. I learned every system, patched every crisis, taught new hires how to steady their hands when everything fell apart. When a supplier collapsed in 2014, I handled negotiations alone while the executives hid in a hotel conference room pretending to strategize. They praised me afterward, called me a pillar, but never once offered a promotion. I didn't complain. I thought loyalty was its own kind of power. The first signs of trouble were so subtle I brushed them off. Meetings scheduled without me, younger managers suddenly sitting at tables I used to lead, conversations that stopped the moment I walked by. I told myself I was overthinking it. Stress, fatigue, nothing more. It wasn't until one Tuesday morning that everything clicked into place, though at the time I didn't know it yet. At 8:12 a.m., a notification pinged across my screen. Strategic realignment session, mandatory. No explanation, no sender listed. The kind of vague formality we never used before Bryce Hartwell became CEO. He was a man obsessed with buzzwords, agility, disruption, modernization, words that sounded important but usually translated to layoffs disguised as vision. He strutted around the office with that polished confidence executives buy from expensive leadership retreats. Employees pretended to admire it. I pretended too. Still, I didn't think the meeting had anything to do with me. Why would it? I'd spent 12 years patching their holes, protecting their shipments, smoothing their disasters. If anything, I assumed I'd be advising on whatever shift Bryce thought would impress the board this quarter. When I walked toward briefing room B2, the hallway felt unusually quiet, as if conversations had peeled away from the air just seconds before I stepped in. People looked busy, too busy. No one met my eyes. I brushed it off and pushed open the door. 3 people sat inside: Bryce, Leah from HR, and a young man I recognized only vaguely, a man I'd passed maybe twice in the hallway, always wearing expensive watches and that cocky smile people get when they've never been told no in their lives. I didn't know his name then. I didn't realize I was looking at the person who'd been chosen to replace me. I wish I could say the truth hit me instantly, but denial is powerful. It lets you take one more step, sit in one more chair, believe for one more moment that everything you've built is still standing. I didn't know it yet, but something in that room had already cracked, and in a few minutes, it would break completely. Bryce didn't even let me settle into the chair before he launched into his performance. He straightened his tie like he was about to walk onto a stage instead of ripping apart 12 years of someone's life. "Celine," he began, voice smooth and falsely sympathetic, "we appreciate everything you've contributed, but we're realigning toward a younger, more adaptive leadership structure." It sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced in front of a mirror. Leah from HR kept her eyes glued to her tablet, tapping like she was taking notes, though I knew her hands shook when she was nervous. And then there was the young man. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, confidence radiating off him like heat from asphalt. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't smile. He just watched me the way someone might watch a show they already knew the ending to. Bryce gestured toward him as if presenting a prize. "This is Evan. He'll be assuming your responsibilities effective immediately." My responsibilities, my systems, my crisis plans, my workflows, handed to someone who probably couldn't tell the difference between a routing error and a system crash. I felt the words hit like a blunt force, not sharp enough to cut but heavy enough to bruise. Effective immediately? I asked, though my voice barely had shape. Bryce nodded as if he expected applause. This is about evolution, Celine. The company needs fresh energy. Fresh energy. That was the phrase he landed on. Not competence, not experience, not stability. Fresh energy. Corporate code for youthful faces that photographed well on brochures. I kept waiting for someone to say more, to soften the blow, to offer a shred of dignity, but the silence stretched until I understood there was nothing left to say. They hadn't called me in to discuss a transition plan, or to thank me, or even to pretend I mattered. They had called me in to remove me. Swiftly, cleanly, with as little inconvenience to themselves as possible. When Bryce finally stopped speaking, Evan shifted in his seat, tapped his expensive watch, and looked at the door as if he was already bored. That was the moment my humiliation crystallized. Not the firing, not the shallow reasoning. It was the fact that he didn't even consider me worthy of attention. Like I was an outdated appliance they were finally discarding. I stood up slowly because I refused to let them see me scramble or shake. Leah finally looked at me then. Just a flicker, a flash of guilt before she smoothed her expression back to neutral. I didn't trust myself to speak. I simply nodded once, turned, and walked out. The hallway felt colder than it had minutes earlier, quieter too. When I rounded the corner toward my office, my stomach dropped. My door was locked. Outside, it sat a neat stack of cardboard boxes, already labeled with my name. Someone had done this ahead of time, days ahead probably. The decision hadn't been made that morning. It had been made, processed, approved, printed, boxed, and taped before anyone bothered to inform me. I knelt and opened the top box. My old team photo stared back at me, the one taken during the logistics surge of 2018 when we'd pulled off a 12-week miracle. I looked younger, hopeful, unaware that the very people praising me then would one day replace me without hesitation. The embarrassment curled hot in my chest, but beneath it was something colder, sharper, betrayal, real, deliberate betrayal. I carried the boxes to the elevator, each step heavier than the last. Every person I passed found a reason to look away, a phone call, a printer jam, a sudden need to walk in the opposite direction. I wasn't a colleague anymore. I was an inconvenience, a ghost. When the elevator doors closed, the weight of it finally slammed into me. My work, my loyalty, my sacrifices, discarded in under 10 minutes. And as the elevator dropped, I had no idea that something far bigger was already coming for them, something they never saw, something they couldn't stop. I don't remember stepping out of the elevator. I don't remember crossing the lobby or pushing through the glass doors into the cold air outside. My body was moving, but my mind was somewhere between disbelief and a kind of hollow numbness I'd never felt before. I sat down on the low concrete ledge beside the parking garage, the box of my belongings resting against my leg like dead weight. For a long moment, I just stared at the ground, feeling the shock throb through me in waves. That's when my phone buzzed in my pocket. An unknown number. I almost ignored it. I didn't have the energy to deal with a scam call or an automated survey, but something in me hesitated. Habit, maybe, or instinct. I answered without thinking. Celine Ward? The voice was calm, professional, steady. I swallowed hard. Yes. My name is Harper Lane. I represent a private client with interest in leadership shifts within the logistics technology sector. I believe your name just fell off Northbridge's internal roster. The words landed strangely, like they were meant for someone else. I blinked, trying to process it. How would you even... Information moves quickly, she interrupted, not unkindly. My client would like to speak with you. Today, if possible. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded clarity. But in that moment, sitting there with humiliation still burning under my skin, I felt something I hadn't expected. Validation. Someone out there knew my worth even when my own company had just dismissed it. All right, I said, my voice quiet. Send me the details. When the call ended, I stared ahead, feeling the cold wind sting my eyes. Harper's words echoed in my ears, but I didn't know whether to believe them. My phone buzzed again, another unknown number. For a second I considered letting it ring out, but curiosity or desperation won. Celine, the voice said, deeper this time. Familiar, though distant, like a memory I hadn't touched in years. This is Julian Cross. My breath caught in my throat. The CEO of Vectoris Systems, Northbridge's biggest competitor. The man whose name circled industry conferences like a quiet storm. Strategic, composed, respected, and absolutely untouchable. I heard what happened, he said. No theatrics, no pity, just certainty. Northbridge made a mistake. I closed my eyes, trying to steady the tightness in my chest. How would you know already? Because I pay attention, he replied simply, and because you've been on my radar for a long time. The world shifted a little under my feet. He continued, I'd like to meet, somewhere quiet, just a conversation. Just a conversation. Nothing in our world was ever just anything, and we both knew it. I wasn't sure whether I should feel honored or alarmed, maybe both. Is this about a job? I finally asked. He gave a soft laugh, warm but edged with purpose. Let's not jump ahead, but I think this moment might be the beginning of something important for you. Important. Coming from a man like him, that word carried weight. I stared down at my cracked coffee mug inside the box, the symbol of everything I'd lost in a single morning. And yet, for the first time in hours, something inside me flickered. Small, fragile, but unmistakably alive. Tell me where to meet you, I said, and as the wind rushed past, carrying the chill of a closing door and the heat of another cracking open, I didn't know it yet. But this call would not just change my career. It would change the entire future of Northbridge. Julian chose a quiet cafe tucked between an insurance office and a florist shop, the kind of place people walked past without noticing. Inside, the lighting was soft, warm, almost too gentle for the kind of conversation I knew we were about to have. He stood when I walked in, offering a handshake that was firm but not performative, a man who didn't need theatrics to show authority. Celine, he said, motioning to the chair across from him. Thank you for coming on such short notice. I sat, feeling strangely exposed under the calm hush of clinking cups and murmured conversations. The waitress dropped off water and disappeared without lingering. Julian folded his hands, studying me with a measured focus that made my pulse kick up. I'll be direct, he said. Northbridge Dynamics has been on shaky ground for some time. I expect a major shift within the next quarter. My brow tightened. A shift like what? He slid a slim black folder across the table. Open it. Inside was a full acquisition strategy. Vectoris Systems preparing to buy out Northbridge. Each page carried the weight of months of planning, revenue forecasts, integration timelines, leadership restructures, transition protocols. But what made my breath hitch was a small table near the end. There, next to a provisional leadership chart, sat my name. Executive Transition Director, I whispered, reading it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Interim authority during the post-acquisition phase. Julian's voice was calm. Your work has been undervalued for years. We intend to change that. A swirl of disbelief and something warmer, something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time, settled in my chest. Why me? I asked. Why now? Because everything that holds Northbridge together came from people like you, people they pushed aside when leadership wanted something shinier. He leaned back. And because you know how the company really works, that knowledge is priceless in a turnover. I closed the folder slowly, grounding myself. It was too much, too fast. Hope felt dangerous. I need time, I said. Of course. He tapped the table gently. But remember something, you're not starting from zero. You're stepping into a position you already earned. They were simply too blind to see it. We ended the meeting with an unspoken understanding. This wasn't a job pitch, it was a door. a door to something bigger than titles or revenge. But when I walked out into the cool air, I felt a sudden surge of clarity. Something clicked inside me, like a puzzle piece snapped into place. A memory, a file, a clause. It hit me so hard I stopped walking. Years ago, during a governance cleanup project, I'd been temporarily seated on a board subcommittee. I didn't think about it at the time. I was buried in policy revisions, scanning paragraphs that barely made sense to anyone without a legal background. But I remembered a specific line, something I had added quickly and quietly, assuming it would never matter. I rushed home, heart pounding, and tore through my old storage boxes until I found the external drive I hadn't touched in years. Dust puffed into the air when I plugged it in. File after file scrolled past, outdated protocols, draft policies, abandoned proposals, until finally I saw it. NB Governance. Update V12B TDF. My hands shook as I opened it. There it was, page 39, section 4B. Any former board-affiliated contributor shall retain a 75-day oversight and advisory right during periods of transitional ownership or pending acquisition. I stared at the sentence, stunned. Oversight and advisory right, during acquisition, and it was signed by me. Dated, logged, valid. They thought they erased me. They forgot I ever touched board policy. They didn't even know this clause existed. But it existed, and it gave me something Northbridge never imagined I could have again. Legal access, legal presence, legal power. As the meaning settled into me, slow and electrifying, something inside that humiliation from earlier began to shift. I wasn't done, and they weren't safe. The morning after I found the clause, I woke as if someone had plugged me back into my own life. The humiliation from my firing was still there, but it wasn't crushing me anymore. It was sharpening me. Every betrayal, every whispered conversation, every door that had quietly closed behind my back, they all suddenly felt like pieces of a larger pattern I should have seen sooner. Now I intended to use that pattern against them. At 7:04 a.m., I drafted a single email, just one line. Let's talk. I sent it to 4 people, names I hadn't spoken out loud in years but hadn't forgotten for a second. Jenna Aubrey, who built half the workflow systems Northbridge still depended on. Thomas Green, the logistics coordinator they blamed during a supplier collapse that wasn't his fault. Ria Patel, who redesigned an entire onboarding program only to be cut during a budget review. And Owen Briggs, the gruff, sarcastic technician who once told me the only thing holding the company together was duct tape and 2 sane people. They all replied within minutes. It didn't surprise me. People who've been wrong don't forget the person who stood with them when everything fell apart. By noon, I sat across from Jenna in a small corner booth at an old wine bar that opened early for quiet meetings. She looked tired, older than I remembered, weighed down by the years since she'd been pushed out. But when she looked up, her eyes brightened with something like relief. "I knew something was wrong the moment your name disappeared from the directory," she said, voice low. "They've been scrambling since you left." "Scrambling how?" Her smile was sharp. "You were the only one who knew how the production pipeline actually worked. Evan's been trying to guess his way through it." That didn't surprise me either. After Jenna left, Thomas arrived next, still carrying the calm energy that once steadied our chaotic nights. He brought documents, notes he'd kept from his final months, showing mistakes leadership ignored because admitting them would make them look incompetent. Then came Ria, then Owen. Each meeting added another thread to the web, was weaving. Another crack in Northbridge's shiny facade. I didn't tell them about the clause yet. Not the full weight of it, not the door it opened. All they needed to know was that I wasn't done, and neither were they. Over the next 3 days, I met people in quiet corners of cafes, parking lots, empty co-working lounges, the forgotten, the undervalued, the dismissed. People who'd carried the company while leadership posed for photos. They shared stories I hadn't heard, overlooked renewals, botched client calls, mismanaged accounts, all under the new, younger leadership Bryce loved to brag about. The deeper the conversations went, the clearer the truth became. Northbridge wasn't functioning, it was barely standing, and the people now leading it were too arrogant to see the walls crumbling around them. Every night, I returned home with scraps of information, small puzzle pieces that didn't look like much alone. But when I laid them out on my table, one by one, they formed a map of failure, negligence, and ego-driven decisions that had weakened the company far more than anyone on the outside realized. I documented everything, quietly, meticulously, with the discipline of someone who had once kept an entire corporation from collapsing under its own weight. I wasn't planning sabotage. I wasn't planning theatrics. I was planning truth, cold, precise, undeniable. And when the acquisition hit, and it would hit fast, Northbridge's leadership would finally face the consequences they'd been running from. Not because I shouted, not because I made a scene, but because I was bringing back the one thing they thought they had destroyed the moment they locked my office door: the people who actually built the company. And now, united again, we were ready for the quiet storm I was preparing to unleash. When I walked back into Northbridge with my new badge clipped to my coat, no one questioned it. No one even paused long enough to ask who authorized it. That was the first sign things had fallen further than I imagined. The receptionist gave me a polite, distracted smile, the kind you offer someone you assume belongs there. Maybe that was the most revealing detail, how quickly they forgot the woman they spent years relying on. The badge read, Strategic Advisor, a title vague enough to slip into any room without challenge. I didn't need anything more. My oversight rights were legally logged. HR had no idea what to do with them, so they did what frightened people often do. They pretended everything was normal. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than it used to, as if the building itself sensed the hollowness spreading through it. When the doors opened, I stepped into a hallway filled with a noise I'd never associated with Northbridge before. Confusion. Not the productive kind. The kind that brewed from fear and bad decisions. Phones rang with no one answering. Teams whispered behind half-closed doors, huddled over laptops like they were shielding secrets. A junior analyst brushed past me, papers spilling from her arms. She didn't even apologize. Her eyes were wide, frantic, fixed on something far beyond me. Chaos was the new dress code. And in the center of it was Evan, my replacement, leading a meeting he clearly didn't understand. Through a glass wall, I watched him stand at the head of the table, waving his tablet like a shield, while managers exchanged uncertain glances. He mispronounced a client's name twice, promised deliverables the team didn't have the capacity to produce, then snapped at a coordinator for asking a perfectly reasonable question. I lingered outside, unseen behind the doorframe. He didn't know how exposed he looked, how transparent his panic was. Bryce had thrown him into a position he wasn't ready for, and instead of admitting it, Evan was flailing, loudly, blindly, dangerously. When the meeting broke, I walked to the temporary office they'd assigned to me. It had a window overlooking the parking lot, and a desk too polished for real work. They thought it was a courtesy. They thought keeping me at arm's length was enough to maintain control. What they didn't realize was that distance only gave me a better vantage point. From my seat, I watched the fault lines widen, a delayed shipment no one escalated, a renewal contract sitting unsigned on someone's desk, two departments fighting over responsibility for a failed rollout. Every crisis had one thing in common. They all tied back to decisions Evan made while trying to prove he was capable of filling my shoes. Throughout the day, emails trickled in, operations logs, meeting summaries, a few frantic messages forwarded accidentally by overworked analysts. I never asked for any of it. People simply didn't know where else to send problems anymore. They only knew the company was breaking, and instinct drove them toward the person who once kept it alive. I took notes, not to fix anything, but to understand the scale of the collapse. The truth was harsher than I expected. Northbridge wasn't struggling, it was unraveling, and no one at the top had the skill or humility to stop it. As I closed my notebook that evening, watching the office lights flicker unevenly across the floor, one thing became painfully clear. They hadn't just fired the wrong person. They had replaced the foundation of their house with cardboard, and now the storm was arriving. The announcement dropped at exactly 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, delivered through a company-wide email with the kind of sterile wording only lawyers could write. Northbridge Dynamics confirms the appointment of Celine Ward as acting chief executive officer during the transitional review period. 7 minutes later, it hit every inbox. By 9:10, Slack channels went silent. By 9:13, people were peering over cubicle walls like animals sensing an incoming quake. No welcome parade, no speech, no dramatic walk. Down the hallway. I simply picked up my notebook, left the advisor's office, and stepped into a building holding its breath. When I reached the executive floor, the air shifted. Evan was standing near the conference room, pale and stiff, a stack of papers clenched in his fist. He tried to speak, maybe to protest, maybe to pretend he still had authority, but whatever words he rehearsed died the moment he met my gaze. I didn't stop to comfort him or to gloat. This wasn't about him anymore. This was bigger than the fragile ego of a man who thought he could inherit competence. The CEO's office door was cracked open as if waiting for me. I pushed it fully and stepped inside. The room had been redecorated with a style that tried too hard. Gold accents, modern art, a ridiculous leather chair angled for power photos. On the desk sat a glowing nameplate with Evan's title still blinking. I unplugged it without ceremony, placed it gently in a box, and began clearing the space with quiet precision. The absurd glass trophy labeled Next Gen Innovator went first, then the stack of corporate jargon notebooks, then the empty brainstorming journals he liked to display for meetings. At the bottom drawer, I found something unexpected, my old coffee mug, the one I thought had been thrown out. Someone must have shoved it aside to make room for Evan's props. A small crack still ran down the handle. I placed it on the desk, and for the first time since everything began, the room felt right again. By afternoon, the formal notices were completed. Legal validated my oversight rights. HR updated system access. Department heads received meeting requests with my name on them. And then the real work began. 15-minute private sessions with every employee who had stayed behind after I was pushed out. Some arrived anxious, hands shaking, voices small. Others came defiant, eager to convince me that they had nothing to do with what happened. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't lecture. I asked only one question. Why didn't you say anything? The honest ones broke quickly. I was scared, Celine. They said speaking up would mark me as uncooperative. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't think you'd actually be fired. Their regret was real, but regret didn't erase choices. I listened, took notes, and let silence do most of the work. Then came Megan, my former assistant. She entered slowly, eyes already wet, clutching her phone like a shield. She didn't sit until I nodded. I don't deserve your kindness, she whispered. I did everything they asked. I sent reports on you. I forwarded your emails. I even printed the memo about your removal. Her voice cracked. I thought I was protecting myself. For a moment, I let the weight of her confession settle. She wasn't trying to save her job, she was trying to recover her own conscience. I walked around the desk, stood beside her, and spoke quietly. You don't owe me an apology. You owe the truth. She nodded, shoulders trembling with relief and shame. She wasn't the only one who needed to hear that. The last meeting of the day was with Martin Hale, head of strategy, the man who had built his career on polished confidence and inflated numbers. He strolled in without being scheduled, smiling like we were old allies. Celine, he said, we should discuss how we'll work together. Your leadership, my insights. There's real synergy here. I reached into my drawer, pulled out a sealed envelope, and placed it on the table between us. What's this? He asked, the smile faltering. Your termination, I answered, effective immediately. For once, Martin had nothing to say. He took the envelope, stood stiffly, and left without a word. Out in the hallway, a few heads subtly turned, watching everything shift, watching the storm they thought would never come. I closed my notebook gently, not triumphantly. This wasn't revenge, not really. It was a reckoning. Long overdue, sharply delivered, and necessary. And tomorrow, I would begin rebuilding the place they tried to bury me in. By the following week, the building moved with a different rhythm. People weren't whispering in corners anymore. They were watching, recalibrating, learning what accountability actually looked like. I didn't need to bark orders or parade authority down the hallways. My presence was enough. My decisions were enough. I restored departments one meeting at a time, putting capable people back where they belonged, untangling the knots Evan and Bryce had tightened without understanding. I brought Jenna in as senior systems lead. Thomas took oversight of crisis logistics. Rhea rebuilt onboarding. Owen handled infrastructure integrity. Each of them stepped into the roles they had quietly deserved for years, and the company's foundation steadied beneath their hands. One afternoon, while walking past the conference room, the same one where I had once been told my experience no longer aligned with their direction, I stopped. Through the glass, my new leadership team sat gathered around the table, working through a recovery roadmap we had rebuilt from scratch. It wasn't pride I felt. It was recognition. This was what Northbridge had always been meant to be before ego and nepotism choked it. As I stepped into the hallway again, a young analyst hurried toward me, stopping abruptly. "I don't want to bother you," she said, voice small. "But how did you stay calm through everything? How did you keep going when they tried to erase you?" I held her gaze for a long moment. "It was personal," I told her, "but it didn't have to be messy. When you know your value, you don't argue. You act, and sometimes staying silent isn't weakness. It's preparation." She nodded, something shifting behind her eyes, as if she understood more than she expected to. That evening, long after most of the building emptied, I sat alone in the corner office, my office. I opened my notebook and wrote a single line on a fresh page. "Integrity lasts longer than titles." I closed the cover, rested my hand on it for a moment, and let the stillness settle around me. I wasn't the woman they tried to discard. I was the woman who rebuilt the company they never truly understood. And I wasn't done yet. There's something I learned the hard way. Staying silent to keep the peace can destroy you far faster than speaking up ever will. When Northbridge tried to erase me, I realized it wasn't the betrayal that hurt the most. It was all the small moments I ignored along the way. The skipped meetings, the closed doors, the way people stopped asking for my input because it made them feel threatened. I let comfort lull me into believing loyalty was protection, when in reality it was a leash. If there's one truth that came out of everything, it's this. Corruption grows best in quiet rooms. People with power love when you doubt your voice, because your silence gives them space to manipulate the narrative. But the moment you step out of the shadows, even if your voice shakes, the structure they built on ego begins to crack. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as simple as saying, "I see what's happening and I won't pretend I don't." And sometimes forgiveness is the way you free yourself. But sometimes silence is the sharpest knife, especially when you use it to let the truth speak for itself. In real life, you might not get a perfect comeback or a dramatic reversal, but you can reclaim your dignity by refusing to let other people define your worth. If you feel overlooked, manipulated, or quietly pushed aside, don't wait for permission to act. Start by telling the truth, to yourself, to someone you trust, or even just in writing. Then take one small step forward. How to get started today. Write down one boundary you've been avoiding setting. Reach out to someone who once supported you and reconnect. Identify one place in your life where silence has become harmful. Take a single action that shifts power back to you. If you've ever faced a situation like mine, or you're in the middle of one now, share your story in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and share the video. Your voice matters more than you think.